Immanuel is a Hebrew word that literally means God is with us. Immanu, with us, El, God. And so, Immanuel's law implies that its demonstrable proof of God's existence can stand as a falsifiable scientific law. Meaning, Immanuel's law can stand as the outcome of first, the forming of rational hypotheses from critical observations. Second, the securing of objective means to test the efficacy of those hypotheses. And finally, the making of critical predictions that are not apparent in the initial observations. Basically, like any other scientific law, Immanuel law implies a demonstrable proof that enables us to grow in objective understanding. Also, to understand what Immanuel's law is, we must understand what Immanuel's law is not. And Immanuel's law is not another creationist or intelligent design argument. Those arguments are either what philosophers call cosmological arguments, wherein one argues that all things derive from a first cause, or what philosophers call teleological arguments, wherein one argues that the complexity of the creation suggests a designer. Simply put, the arguments are enticing, or even true. However, they amount to dogmatic proclamations because they are not scientifically provable in a way that we can objectively grow in our scientific understanding. Regardless of Immanuel's law's efficacy, we might add that the Church stands upon faith and not scientific prediction. We enjoy the religious liberty to believe as we seek knowledge, but we must recognize that belief, trust, and faith usually, by nature, stride ahead of proof. Science is at a crossroads. Scientists are finding it increasingly difficult to create technological apparatuses to test theories. The general public is losing a consensus about greater truths. As a result, educational institutes are increasingly becoming out of touch as they cannot reconcile the public with any standard. And so, representative democracy is becoming increasingly balkanized, and the people's freedoms in this way erode. In response, non-democratic powers in the global economy are growing in strength. The following are questions that stand at the center of this dilemma. Are we, as human beings, limited in our capacity to wrest knowledge out of the universe? And is the universe even knowable? All want to know, is there a greater truth? Epistemology is a main branch of philosophy. Epistemology is a study that seeks to establish the means to justify our knowledge of anything. The study seeks to determine whether we have an inherent sense perception capacity to justify our knowledge, or whether the nature of our environments impresses the structure of our knowledge upon us. One may think of epistemology as a critical study that is akin to the nature versus nurture question. Therefore, the epistemological study is vital because its quest has theological, philosophical, scientific, and political implications. For example, the theological question of divine providence versus our free will is like an epistemological question. Likewise, the theological dispute between justification by faith versus justification by religious works reflects the epistemological question. And politically speaking, the epistemological question loomed over the opposing perspectives between the framers of the American Constitution and the framers of the French Constitution. The American framers concluded that humankind's state of nature is that of a reasoning being that seeks enlightenment and self-determination with little government, whereas the French framers considered humankind's state of nature to be selfish and brutish, requiring government to suppress humankind's voracious tendencies. And so, how society frames the epistemological question determines who one is and can be. We have noted that the formal concern of the epistemological question seeks to determine the internal or external source for the justification of our knowledge. But let us now consider that the more abstract sense of the epistemological question is akin to the nature versus nurture question, which seeks to understand whether our physical or social environments impress our conduct upon us, or whether our inner cognitive and physical capacities determine our conduct. So if we abstractly consider the epistemological question in regards to our theological understanding of faith, we may recognize that the Apostle Paul and the 16th century German reformer Martin Luther framed our Western epistemological sensibilities in regards to the efficacy of our faith. The Apostle Paul and Martin Luther both are the key men who championed the doctrinal understanding that the justification of our knowledge through faith is divinely conferred upon us, regardless of the personal pursuits of religious works that do not justify us. This doctrine played a greater role in compelling the masses into accepting secular government and religious liberty than the Enlightenment did. In fact, only the educated elite could appreciate the Enlightenment's philosophical awakening. The enlightened philosophers who inspired the opposing ideals of the American Constitution and the French Constitution were the 17th century philosopher John Locke and the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, respectively. Locke inspired the American Constitution with the understanding that humankind's state of nature entails an internal capacity of a reasoning being that seeks enlightenment and self-determination with little government, whereas Rousseau inspired the French Constitution stance that the government must fashion a just environment that mitigates humankind's voracious and brutish state of nature. Even so, if we consider the epistemological question in the formal sense of determining the internal or external sources of our knowledge, then we must recognize the following key men who form Western culture's formal epistemological understanding. These men are Plato, Aristotle, Sir Isaac Newton, and Immanuel Kant. First, Plato, a war veteran of the Peloponnesian War, witnessed the strengths and weaknesses of monarchic, aristocratic, and democratic governments warring against each other. He came to the conclusion that only philosophers could successfully rule nations. Appreciating the mathematical and geometric understandings of his day, Plato understood that we perceive an imperfect world that adheres to scientific laws, which Plato thought of as perfect forms, perfect ideas. And so Plato understood that the justification for our knowledge derives from our capacity to reason mathematically. Thus, Plato understood that an education about our environment through reason can only apprehend the hidden truths needed to govern. Next, Aristotle went beyond Plato's epistemological understanding. Rather than merely invoking the concept that we, through reason, apprehend perfect truths beyond the temporal world that we empirically observe, Aristotle emphasized further an internal and rational capacity for the justification of our knowledge. To this end, Aristotle produced a first-order logic, a systematic treatment of reasoning. Aristotle developed principles governing correct inferences, and he codified formal syntactical principles for logical formulas. Aristotle used his system of logic and arrived at the epistemological conclusion that our empirical judgment rests upon our inherent ability to ascertain the basic indivisible nature of being, which Aristotle, without falsifiable evidence, listed into categories such as substance, quantity, quality, among others. Aristotle then drew from his rich body of work and advised that a representative government representing the interests of every caste of society is best suited to secure the happiness of everyone. Despite Aristotle's long-term popularity, eventually the mathematical musings of Aristotle's formal logic failed to predict the 16th century celestial observations of Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo Galilei. They observed the true configuration of the solar system, demonstrating that the sun is at the solar system's center instead of the earth. They therefore contradicted church teachings, which at the time relied heavily upon Aristotle. The 17th century natural philosopher Sir Isaac Newton then demonstrated that the workings of the universe can truly be understood mechanically, using methodical tests and analysis. Newton observed that all things in our environments adhere to 3 laws of motion under universal gravity, within what Newton perceived to be uniform and self-sufficient space and time. Newton even coined the course of action of not attempting to describe what Newton considered to be the unfalsifiable causes of the natural laws, such as the law of gravity. Newton said that he could not discover the objective reason for the law of gravity, so he framed no hypothesis. Other natural philosophers even followed Newton's example by their only considering the behavior of things under natural laws. And so, to define the directedness of nature, they observed 2 key laws of thermodynamics. First, that energy converts from one form to another without being lost. And second, that all aggregate systems succumb to entropy, even disorder, a losing of energy during a system's cycle. Finally, the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant defined an epistemological understanding that corresponded with Newton's uniform and self-sufficient worldview. Kant even grounded the mathematical musings of Aristotle's formal logic, which had attempted to define our cognitions of the world. The important conclusion of Kant's work is that Kant recognized that the falsifiable justification for our knowledge rests upon our intuition of space and time. Indeed, Kant concluded that our intuition of space and time gives us a reasoning capacity. To prove his conclusion, Kant simply recognized that we have a priori knowledge, that is, knowledge prior to our environmental experience, and we have a posteriori knowledge, that is, knowledge that results from our environmental experience. To explain how the intuition of space and time instigates our rational analysis, Kant made the distinction between our analytic conceptions, which are conceptions that are self-evident, and our synthetic conceptions, which are conceptions that we make when we seem to derive falsifiable conclusions that are not evident in the content of our conceptions. You see, most took for granted that all our conceptions prior to our environmental experience are a priori analytic, meaning self-evident, dogmatic, without proof, while all our conceptions after our environmental experience are a posteriori synthetic. However, Kant observed that our intuitive cognizance of objects emerging in space and time gives us the mathematical capacity to rationalize experience and formulaic expectations that are provable even prior to experience. For example, Kant observed that we are instinctively cognizant of the addition process of adding numbers like 7 plus 5 to derive 12, prior to our actually checking to see if we have evaluated our arithmetic. In other words, Kant understood that we are cognizant of functional operations such as f of x equals x plus 5, where the particularity of the numbers are distinct from the overall function. Thereby, Kant observed that the actual numbers in the function become a synthesis to derive a provable conclusion, sometimes prior to experience, that is, a priori synthetic. With his observation that we possess a priori synthetic understanding, Immanuel Kant went on to observe that the centrality of our knowledge structure stands upon our intuitively assessing the typification of objects arising in space and time per the categories of judgment that Aristotle attempted to define. For example, Kant understood that we intuitively categorize objects in terms of similitude, succession, and species kind. To this day, there remain profound theological and political ramifications of Immanuel Kant's work. Kant seemingly showed that our conceptions of God and our personhood are a priori analytic, that is, not extensive and scientifically provable within space and time. Kant's work therefore champions the position that all knowledge that informs the public discourse must have a scientific basis and not a faith-based basis. Of course, Immanuel's law seeks to prove Immanuel Kant wrong by demonstrating that it is an a priori synthetic judgment, which is an objective hypothesis that can be established as a scientific law within space and time. Plato, Aristotle, Newton, and Kant's classical approach to establishing epistemological understanding depends upon two factors. One, there must be an environment where an unbroken cause, effect, similitude, and succession advance within uniform space and time. And two, the mind's unified self-perspective must obviously derive from a unified physicality in the brain of some sort. Contemporary science seemingly destroys both factors, as it demonstrates that space-time is not uniform and that the mind does not derive from a unified physicality. Sir Isaac Newton's mechanics captured the best objective description for the classical philosopher's conception of space and time. However, people soon realized that Newtonian mechanics was incomplete. You see, in Newton's time, natural philosophers thought of light, electricity, and heat as material fluids. Therefore, Newtonian mechanics could not explain how materials emit and absorb energy in the form of heat and radiation. Particularly, Newtonian mechanics could not explain the coloration that bodies assume when heated. So, to explain how materials emit and absorb energy, contemporary scientists have produced a standard model of the universe. The model amounts to being a statistics-based means for making scientific determinations while denying exactitude. And so, as we shall see, the model successfully makes falsifiable predictions of the things that we witness in everyday life. However, the model ultimately ends up being functionally indeterminate. It fails to explain the originating cause for their universe in a falsifiable manner. Like so, the model denies epistemology's objective bird's-eye view of the way in which the environment unfolds to establish our understanding. The realization of a need to produce the statistics-based interpretation of the universe began when physicist Max Planck made an important discovery as he tried to understand how bodies emit and absorb energy. To resolve the issue, Planck discovered that energy actually exists in a discrete constant of proportionality. His discovery countered natural philosophers' beliefs that energy exists in a uniform and infinite range. The German physicist Albert Einstein then proved Planck's discovery by demonstrating that light, like all other forms of energy, exists as discrete and specific particle waves. And so Einstein demonstrated that only specific frequencies of light induce electrons to emit from metals. As to be expected, Einstein's observation confounded natural philosophers, because they held the classical view of lights being a fluid. They thought that the intensity or volume of light should transfer enough energy for the electrons to emit. Still, even further building upon the understanding that energy is not an unending range of intensities, Einstein discovered that energy and mass are actually interchangeable, to the extent that space and time are integral and not absolute. Einstein discovered that space, time, and the matter and the energies that comprise it are limited by the prohibition that nothing surpasses light speed, in which case infinite energy would be needed to propel matter to surpass light speed. And we know that infinite energy does not exist in the world that we observe, only the finite energies of the world's systems. To this end, physicists soon produced some initial experiments that proved Einstein's theory. The experiments showed that mass increases with velocity, a demonstration that space-time only allows limited velocities under light speed. At the same time, the experiments show that time slows down per the increased velocity of one's reference frame as one progressively approaches the speed of light. Contemporary science's current standard model is the most comprehensive proof of Max Planck and Albert Einstein's findings. Because past natural philosophers failed to establish epistemological understanding with their incorrect assumption that space and time are uniform, the physicists who use the Standard Model do not seek to determine the philosophical implications of Planck and Einstein's findings. They only seek to establish mathematical models that predict nature's behavior as nature adheres to Planck and Einstein's findings. To explain the quintessential forces of energy, the Standard Model therefore quantifies four fundamental forces that particle waves represent. The four forces are the gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, the weak subatomic nuclear force, and the strong subatomic nuclear force. Moreover, the Standard Model demonstrates that the four force-carrying particle waves are exchanged between other respective particle waves that occupy all fields of space-time. And so, physicists consider the Standard Model to be a quantum field theory that mathematically predicts how forces are exchanged in nature. In fact, the model demonstrates that during the force exchanges, particles annihilate one another to become pure energy. The annihilation proves Einstein's theory that energy and matter are interchangeable. To explain how materials actually emit and absorb energy in relation to the four forces, the Standard Model features a mathematics-based model of the atom. The atomic model strictly recognizes the fact that energy exists as a mathematical proportionality and not as a uniform permeation within uniform space and time. Therefore, the Standard Model's configuration of the atom disregards all preconceptions of microscopic space-time realities, which we experience in the macroscopic world. The atomic configuration is solely the result of physicists' attempts to match observed behavior of energy's emission and absorption per energy's constant of proportionality. For example, the atomic configuration consists of an atomic nucleus that positively charged protons and uncharged neutrons comprise. The protons and the neutrons are associated with energy's weak force, while energy's strong force is associated with unobservable fundamental particles within the protons and the neutrons. Then, orbiting the atomic nucleus are negatively charged electrons, balancing the nucleus's positively charged protons. Because the electron is both a particle and a wave, its position and momentum can only be statistically determined. Thus, foregoing any space-time dimensions, physicists determined that the electron exists in specific energy level shells orbiting the atom, and the energy levels correspond to the energy levels of emitting and absorbing photon particle waves. The specific, that is, quantized, atomic shells being so configured to mediate emission and absorption explains Albert Einstein's original observations, in which Einstein determined that materials only emit and absorb specific frequencies of energy. Moreover, the physicist's use of the same inverted mathematical configurations to explain the atomic nucleus's unobservable strong and weak forces explains the radioactive breakdown of the atom. Like so, they understand how the atom's properties transform one atom into another during the atom's radioactive breakdown. The Standard Model's mathematics-based model of the atom ultimately describes the properties of all known elements, as it captures how the atoms succumb to atomic breakdown through radiation. The Standard Model captures an evolutionary framework for the universe, even unto the appearance of life. So far, we have described how the scientists' quantum physics-based interpretation of the universe undermines classical philosophers' epistemological understandings. Indeed, we have essentially observed the fact that to establish the Standard Model's evolutionary description of the universe, scientists must accept the impossibility of past epistemological understandings that depend upon an absolute and uniform universe. Now, we may observe the fact that as scientists observe their evolutionary model, scientists must also accept the impossibility of a unified physicality in the brain. And so, to complete our understanding of how contemporary science makes our pursuit of epistemological understanding impossible, let us briefly describe how the Standard Model champions an evolutionary approach to the universe and intelligent life. First, physicists conclude that a Big Bang must have initiated the universe, because only that much power had the capacity to make the strong force particle waves that hold the nucleus of the atoms together. Then after the Big Bang, physicists conclude that the universe cooled enough to allow the bonding of atoms and the subsequent bondings of the atomic compounds and molecules that make up the materials and properties of the galaxies. Next, scientists conclude that life began because of an evolutionary process that entails the survival of inherited traits that enable living organisms to adapt to ever-changing environments. And scientists believe that the evolutionary process began when complexes of molecular systems became the first self-replicating system to endure metabolic processes that allowed the system to adapt and persist in a greater environment. Biologists, of course, call this self-replicating system a living cell. Here, we must note that Immanuel's law gives a full description of how scientists employ evolutionary theory to describe the way advanced life forms emerged and how scientists' evolutionary approach seems to provide a mechanical picture of the universe in the emergence of life. However, we will now discuss the manner in which Immanuel's law describes the shortfalls of the scientist's evolutionary theory, as it fails to identify a true mechanical description for the emergence of intelligence and its self-awareness. The scientists' search for a mechanical understanding of intelligence primarily rests on their understanding of the neuron cell and the manner in which its electrochemical signaling translates as cognition. Of course, scientists consider the neuron to be a product of evolution because it is the most specialized cell. Most brain matter and central nervous system matter consists of neurons. The neuron is a tree-like shaped cell with a litany of branches called dendrites and roots called axons at opposite ends. Electrochemical charges surge through the neurons as the neuron's branch and root-like structures connect each neuron to other neurons or to muscle fibers. Neuroscientists, neurologists easily grasp a mechanical understanding of the relationship between the environments triggering a sensory neuron's electrochemical excitation and a motor neuron's ensuing electrochemical initiation of a muscle's response. However, neurologists do not have a full mechanical understanding of how the nervous system commands bodily actions upon the environment in ways that seem to demonstrate what appears to be an animal's assertive cognizant will. To explain the animal's assertive capacity, neurologists and cognitive neuroscientists recognize that the neuronal connections are capable of universal computation, as the nervous system is capable of generating innumerable pattern signals. The scientists therefore believe that the signals, like so, supervene over the direct signaling of any corresponding environmental impression. The brain, standing as the fulcrum of the nervous system, neurologists designate the neuronal complexes that are responsible for the body's simple signaling of involuntary operations, such as respiration, as being older evolutionary adaptations. Whereas neurologists consider brain regions that operate during the appearances of an animal's cognitive acts as recent evolutionary adaptations. Not having an understanding of how the neuron's electrochemical firings amount to awareness, cognizance, and sense perceptions, cognitive neuroscientists simply point to the brain regions that are active during the various modes of cognition. Indeed, without seeking to grasp the explicit neuronal correlate of consciousness, cognitive neuroscientists study human cognition by using an information processing model. For instance, they understand that the thalamus neuronal complex plays a role in wakefulness, while the hippocampus plays a role in memory. Moreover, they understand that the cerebral cortex plays a key role in executive decisions. And so, scientists know that each neuronal complex plays a vital role in animal and human cognition. Therefore, scientists believe that the appearance of a unified, supervening, and free consciousness is what they term an epiphenomenon, a phantom mirage. Two key observations compel neurologists to believe that consciousness is a phantom effect of evolved neurological systems. First, neurologists observe brain activity occurring prior to and after conscious and subconscious thoughts. Second, they corroborate that different brain regions are responsible for the constituents of consciousness when damage to the respective brain regions diminish cognitive functions. Scientists' deduction that consciousness is an epiphenomenon follows a logical course of reasoning and so stands without malice. However, the outcome of their unfalsifiable conclusions constitute a profound threat to our liberal society. When scientists assume that consciousness is solely the after-effect of evolved neurological systems, they deny the reality of the freedom of personhood and all the constitutional freedoms, political enfranchisement, and religious rights that stand upon the reality of personhood. What is more, their denial of personhood is a denial of our capacity to substantiate our knowledge as we interact with the world. Essentially, we see that the Standard Model's evolutionary framework denies the breadth of knowledge. The model initially fails to provide a true functional and therefore mechanical picture when it takes for granted that the universe inexplicably began with the Big Bang. Contemporary physicists like Newton failed to frame a demonstrable hypothesis for the cause of the Big Bang, from which the physicists can critically observe the effects. Therefore, the Standard Model fails to explain why energy proceeds from the Big Bang in a quantized manner that disallows exact observation of position and momentum on a microscopic scale. Because of this acceptance of the unknown, the Standard Model disallows us from having an understanding of the intrinsic value or even the ontological being of the world as it stands. Decidedly, the Standard Model is functionally indeterminate, and so it defeats our quest for epistemological understanding. Immanuel's law resolves the reason for contemporary physicists' inability to frame a demonstrable hypothesis for the cause of the Big Bang. It understands that scientists do not understand causality in terms of the manner in which natural laws command the relationship between, first, the coming into being of particular events like particular geometry, intensities, degrees, and iterations, and second, the general or universal identities of the particular events that can potentially come into being. The problem arises as scientists recognize that the particular event that occurs has equal ontological standing, that is, equal possibility of being, with the universal generalization of the event that may potentially arise at some other instance. What scientists deem to be problematic is that particular events seem to suggest pre-existing archetypes that adhere to the natural law's directives of continuity and succession prior to the event's actual coming into being. The intelligence of our knowledge structure stands upon its capacity to anticipate and query for events prior to our actual observation. In this way, our a priori synthetic judgment gives us the capacity for creativity and imagination. Of course, this capacity harkens back to Plato's study of our reasoning ability to apprehend perfect pre-existing forms, Immanuel Kant's transcendental study of perfect ideas, and Martin Heidegger's study of Dasein, a study of our being in the world, where our perceptions stand upon the manner in which events perennially unfold before us. Because scientists cannot establish a functional understanding of causality from the relationship between universal identities and their particular instances, scientists are forced to maintain a classical worldview of causality. That is, they must take a linear view of causality, where they assume that one physical effect is solely the result of a particular physical cause, to the extent that the originating Big Bang event solely initiated causality. It is as though they must conclude that the natural laws followed the originating Big Bang and then somehow reverse themselves to govern the initiation of the Big Bang event. We can see that without an understanding of the natural law's pre-existing directive, which governs causality, scientists cannot truly classify the ontological standing of particular events under the universal reoccurrence of them. Though their standard model accurately predicts most phenomena, their assessments are ultimately functionally indeterminate. The greatest misfortune is that scientists accept the pre-existing laws as being indeterminate. They continue to embrace Isaac Newton's strategy of not forming a hypothesis. Moreover, they embrace Immanuel Kant's conclusion that one cannot derive a falsifiable understanding of anything that is not fully constituted within observable space and time. Immanuel's law takes up Kant's challenge by providing a falsifiable understanding of how God expresses the universe, and so enables our knowledge structure. Immanuel's law consists of three derivative statements, which are preceded by introductory theological and empirical statements. These set the context for the three derivative statements. The theological statement briefly summarizes how the scriptures capture an epistemological description of how God expresses the universe to enable and complete our knowledge structure. Afterward, the empirical statement postulates direct parallels between the scriptures and the world's behavior under the natural law's directives. As a consequence, the empirical statement makes a deduction that the derivative statements not only prove, but also establish an epistemological understanding of. Immanuel's law's first derivative statement then gives a mechanical description of how God expresses the world to enable our knowledge structure. This mechanical description we shall briefly discuss now. Later, we will discuss how the second derivative statement gives a falsifiable description of how consciousness arises from a unified physicality that results from the functional way that God expresses the worlds. Much later, at the end of our presentation, we will briefly discuss how the third derivative statement demonstrates that the falsifiable conclusions map onto an orthodox understanding of the scriptures. We may now summarize how the first derivative statement captures from the theological and the empirical statements a mechanical description of how God expresses the worlds. Then, in the summary's context, we can describe the highlights of the statement. From the theological statement, Immanuel's law recognizes that the pursuit of knowledge is the attempt to comprehend the very being of all we observe. The theological statement understands that absolute knowledge is an indelible synthesis between omnipotence, which is absolute power, omniscience, which is absolute knowledge, and omnipresence, which is universal or absolute presence, to the end that this synthesis is absolute being, Yahweh, in and of himself, God. And so, Immanuel's law recognizes that our epistemological pursuit for knowledge is not only a scientific and philosophical pursuit, it is also a cosmological or even a theological pursuit. In this vein, the important context that the first derivative statement gleans from Immanuel's law's theological and empirical statements is that Yahweh, he who is constituting absolute being in and of himself, therefore needs nothing existential to complete himself. As a consequence, the theological statement recognizes that God's expression of the worlds is entirely beatific, an act of grace, to the end that the entirety of creation appears in indicative states that reflect God's absolute being in order to cultivate our finite knowledge structures in the epistemological order of community and personhood. We, of course, will not cover how the entire doctrinal treatise expounds upon the theological statement's conclusion. However, we must note that the theological statement ends by recognizing that the completion of our personhood and community is the completion of the integrity of our person, which is conscience, as well as the completion of the integrity of our just relations with others. And so, the theological statement recognizes that the ultimate expression of God's fulfilled being is the givenness of God's person in the Christ to fulfill the integrity of conscience, and the givenness of God's person in the Holy Spirit to reconcile the community together under God's justice. To complement the theological statement, the empirical statement observes that the thermodynamic laws of energy reflect the indicative standing of the universe. The empirical statement first notes that the laws dictate how energy invariantly converts from one form to another and how all physical systems lose energy due to entropy. Then, with this understanding, the empirical statement understands that the laws ultimately dictate that nothing entirely exists unto itself. And so, in conclusion, the empirical statement makes the deduction that because light escapes entropy, light's electromagnetic waves in the brain must play a key role in the emergence of consciousness and our subsequent knowledge structure's apprehension of God's indicative expression. To prove the theological and empirical statements, the first derivative statement then presents a functionally determinate and therefore mechanical understanding of the way God expresses the worlds. Like so, the first derivative statement seeks to replace contemporary science's functionally indeterminate understanding of the cause of the Big Bang and energy's discrete emittance from it. The important highlights of the first derivative statement are as follows. The first critical point that the statement recognizes is that energy's discrete emission is a scaled expression of God's absolute power. To understand energy's scaling of God's absolute, the first statement naturally recalls that God's being is a synthesis of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. For this cause, the statement recognizes that energy's functional expression of God's absolute assumes a synthetic analytic form, because the analytic attributes of the expressed function indelibly define one another, though they are existentially distinct. As the key example, we readily see the indelible or even synthetic relationship between space, time, and magnitude as described by Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. We recall that time slows as one's reference frame approaches light speed, even as one's magnitude increases, to the end that God's absolute power would be required for one to surpass light speed. And so, since the theological statement asserts that absolute being is a synthesis of God's omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, the first derivative statement grasps an appreciable way that reflects the synthetic analytic form that energy takes to scale God's absolute. The statement grasps an appreciable understanding by casting God's omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence in the relativity terms of absolute potentiality, absolute perspective, and the absolute momentum of a reference frame. Like so, the statement gauges that the discrete energy scaling of God's absolute force constitutes a functional expression, and the effect of that functional expression is that the ontological being of a thing or event requires that that thing or event have definitive points of reference, magnitude, and velocity within space and time as the thing or event emerges in continuity with the potential events that the discrete scaling of the absolute force permits. And because it recognizes that absolute power is a synthesis with absolute perspective and absolute presence, the first derivative statement recognizes that the functional expression is not only a physical expression, but also a cognitive expression. Therefore, in respect to the more appreciable relativity terms of absolute potentiality, absolute perspective, and the absolute momentum of a reference frame, which is absolute presence, the statement adapts the philosopher's categories of conception to gain an epistemological understanding of the discrete energy scaling of God's absolute power. And knowing that the functional expression's synthetic analytic order makes the categories identity dependent upon one another, the statement captures how the categories all interrelate and successively explain the breadth of the functional expression. Then, having this epistemological understanding of God's functional expression of the worlds, the statement puts forth a falsifiable hypothesis of the Big Bang event and the subsequent cause of energy's discrete emanations. And so finally, the statement presents a functionally determinate understanding of the worlds and thereby replaces science's functionally indeterminate understanding. Recall from above that the interrelating categories are quantity, quality, relation, and modality. We can understand how the first derivative statement begins to build both its functional and epistemological understanding by our understanding that the statement recognizes that God's absolute being, Yahweh, constitutes the centrality of judgment. Then we can understand how the first statement reflects the categories to grasp both a functional and an epistemological understanding of how the particle waves scale God's infinite potentiality, infinite perspective, and infinite presence. You see, by our reimagining the quantity and quality categories as being useful to explain how the particle waves scale God's infinite potentiality, we can understand how the statement captures the function's physical and cognitive expression. Then, by our reimagining the relation and modality categories as being useful to explain how the particle wave scales God's infinite perspective, we can understand how the statement ultimately captures how the function's cognitive expression supervenes over the function's physical expression. In other words, we can understand how the statement captures the prevalence of God's intensive will. And like so, we can understand how the statement procures an epistemological understanding of how God functionally expresses the worlds to create the environmental order and the singular foundation for our knowledge structure. And so finally, by our understanding that the whole of the function's physical and cognitive expression reflects a perennial scaling of God's infinite presence, we can understand how the functional expression governs the existence of any possible thing. As the statement details, we begin to see the quantitative aspect of the functional expression physically when physicists attempt to take determinate measurements of the particle waves. They end up getting the infinite sum of absolute force. As we know from the theory of relativity, infinite force is to us a nonsensical stopping of time and absolute mass. So, the infinite sum measurement shows us that the orderly and measured extension of space-time stands upon the particle waves being indeterminate. That is, their not having actual being as indicated by their not having determinate positions and momentum within space-time. Instead, they only exist at specific energies and mathematical relation to one another, rather than their existing in an infinite mathematical range of energies. Next, we can begin to see the quantitative aspect cognitively as the first derivative statement considers that quantized indeterminate energies scaling of the absolute force is one and the same as the Greek concept of the logos, from which we get our concept of logical expressions. According to the Greek philosophers, the logos is a measure of proportionality, the very definition of a functional expression. So, because the absolute force is a synthesis with absolute perspective and momentum, the first derivative statement does not only consider the functional proportionality in the sense of quantized forces scaling the absolute, the statement also considers the functional proportionality in the sense of its being syntactical attributes that logically structure a cognitive expression. After showing both physically and cognitively the quantitative aspect of God's functional expression, the first derivative statement goes on to show the qualitative aspect of the functional expression, both physically and cognitively. In other words, the first statement shows how the functional expression physically and cognitively qualifies the ontological being of the particle waves as they scale God's absolute potentiality. The statement demonstrates that the particle waves at first seem to have their being in exchanging force-carrying particle waves to qualify the determinate fields of spacetime, wherein the relating fields of spacetime constitute the determinate operations of the physical world that we observe. Indeed, through the particle waves, spacetime's converging and weak fields force exchanges relate to spacetime's expanding fields exchanges of light to comprise the proportional energies that enable the determinate properties of the observable world. Even so, the first derivative statement demonstrates how the particle waves have their actual qualitative being in the functional expression's qualifications. The statement shows that the indeterminate particle waves of themselves do not qualify the emerging determinate world. The particle waves are merely indeterminate quantities of forces that are factors in a functional range of forces that reflect God's absolute force, even God's absolute potentiality. Therefore, the functional range of forces that scale God's absolute being qualifies the emerging world, as evidenced by the absolute force prohibiting the world's determinate systems from breaching light speed. In short, the measured forces that comprise the world causes the world to stand only through the force's relation to God's absolute. Following is showing the qualitative aspect of God's functional expression physically. The first derivative statement demonstrates the qualitative aspect cognitively. It points out that the determinate being of the emergent physical systems maintain the continuity of identity in spacetime despite the particle waves' indeterminate positions and momentum. The statement shows that the emergence of the continuity of identity marks a cognitive qualification because the material systems maintaining identities despite the system's endurance of entropy reflects that the identities that persist are a priori functional relationships that the range of the particular variables of the a posteriori entropic events adheres to. The statement in this way recognizes that only the a priori synthetic cognitive perspectives of one's reference frames relates to these functional relationships. In other words, only the reference frame transcends the particularity of an entropic system, as the reference frame associates with the functional range that the particularities of the events holds to. At this point, we can reimagine the relation and modality categories and see how they assist us in securing an epistemological understanding of how God functionally expresses the worlds to create the environmental order and the singular foundation for our knowledge structure. Indeed, we can envision how Immanuel's law's first derivative statement incorporates the categories and gains an epistemological understanding. And so we can now take a quick look and see how the relation and modality categories are useful in explaining how the particle wave scales God's infinite perspective in a manner that demonstrates how the function's cognitive expression supervenes over the function's physical expression. We have only to keep in mind that God's functional expression of creation is both synthetic and analytic, because God's absolute is a spiritual synthesis, and the substance of the expressed world is only a quantitative reflection that cannot be absolute. In short, we have just seen how the quantity and quality categories are useful in explaining how the particle wave scales God's absolute potentiality to get the quantitative measures of the expressed world. We have only to understand that because God's absolute is a pure spiritual synthesis, the same scaling of God's absolute potentiality is a scaling of God's absolute perspective. And in other words, the scaling of God's absolute perspective is the scaling of God's prevalent reference frame, and the scaling of God's prevalent reference frame is the establishment of our temporal reference frames. For this cause, we may use the relation and modality categories to distinguish our reference frames epistemologically by the manner in which God's functional expression enables our reference frames to transcend our temporal environments to establish our self-perspectives. The only way to observe physically the scaling of God's absolute perspective, that is, God's reference frame, is to establish the priority of the functional expression above the impoverished entropic events that temporally adhere. You see, to distinguish the priority of God's functional expression is to distinguish transferable concepts in the forms of events that adhere despite the varying nature of the subatomic attributes, wherein both the events and the constituents are a direct effect of the functional relationship to the scaling of God's absolute, while they are only identity dependent upon one another. For example, in regards to the relation and modality categories, we begin to see the relation aspect of the functional expression physically when we observe the emergence of determinate geometries, rapidity, intensities, and properties, despite their varying anatomic and quantum makeup. Likewise, we begin to see the modal aspect physically when we observe that a determinate geometry, rapidity, intensity, or property that adheres reflects an infinite potentiality unfolding or blossoming of what could adhere, yet only in continuity with the functional expression. We begin to see the relation and modality categories aspects of the functional expression cognitively when the expression presents the particularity of an event to what, as we shall see, the second derivative statement distinguishes as the self's dynamic mechanism that the brain obtains. The mechanism is distinct from the brain's anatomy, but particularly distinguished by its capacity to mimic the identity-dependent relationship between the transferable properties of macroscopic events with their underlying constituents. And so, the particularity establishes the basicality that is the grounds of self-perspective, while the unfolding paradigm of transferable properties constitutes the environmental network that incites the dynamic mind to rationalize concepts. The result is the emergence of our intentionality as we involuntarily seek to match and personalize the forever blossoming creation. Essentially, using the relation and modality categories, we can grasp an epistemological understanding of how God's functional expression of creation enables our personhood and knowledge structure. Now that we have seen how the categories of human conception are useful for grasping an epistemological understanding of how God physically and cognitively expresses the worlds, we can now see how the whole functional expression reflects God's absolute presence, the very meaning of Immanuel's law. Where contemporary scientists confound epistemological understanding by their accepting functionally indeterminate conclusions, Immanuel's law's first derivative statement grasps how God's functionally determinate expression establishes epistemological understanding. In other words, where contemporary scientists accept an unknown cause for the Big Bang, the natural laws, and inexplicable discrete energy emanations, the first derivative statement understands that quantum behavior means that one cannot reduce causality to any determinate point within spacetime. Therefore, this first statement determines that causality is not linear, but syntactical, to the extent that energy's particle waves are the attributes of the syntactical scaling of God's absolute. Also, the natural laws are the actual syntax of the functional expression. Moreover, as we shall see in Immanuel's law's second derivative statement, where scientists dismiss personhood as an epiphenomenon, even an illusion of a unified reference frame, Immanuel's law's first derivative statement demonstrates that the direct effect of God's functional expression is the effectual coming into being of our dynamic reference frames, which the functional expression incites as the particularity of an event, unfolds into an infinite potentiality of God's bequeathed knowledge and life experience at every instant within spacetime. Thus, instead of a purposeless universe, Immanuel's law's first derivative statement captures the logos of God, even the Hebrew word davar Adonai, which means the event of God, which we know as the Word of God. The forthcoming falsifiable proof of the first derivative statement's conclusion we leave for the second derivative statement, as it demonstrates how our appearing minds are only identity dependent upon the brain and the central nervous system, while being ultimately dependent upon the normalizing effect of the functional expression. The answer to the epistemological question concerning how can we establish what we can know is inherently the ultimate pursuit of philosophy and science. From Immanuel's law's first derivative statement, we know that absolute knowledge is an essence of God's absolute power and presence, Yahweh. Therefore, we understand that unlike God, whose absolute power constitutes all being, we cannot possess absolute knowledge because we possess finite capacities as we progressively interact with, dissect, and evaluate a greater environment per our temporal senses of being. And so we understand that the structure of our knowledge is perennially propositional. For the best means to establish the justified true belief of our knowledge, we wholeheartedly agree with contemporary science's quest to establish our knowledge base upon falsifiable, objective proofs. However, as we noted above, scientists' classical worldview of causality in which they frame their evolutionary theory confounds scientists' objective pursuit. We noted that scientists' linear worldview of causality fails to account for the origin of the natural laws, the cause for energy's discrete emissions, and the cause for quantum indeterminacy. Therefore, we not only recognize that scientists' classical worldview of causality prevents them from framing a falsifiable hypothesis for the cause of the Big Bang and energy's discrete emission from it, but we also recognize how scientists' faulty worldview confounds epistemology's quest to ascertain how our environment arises to structure our thoughts. Along these lines, we mention how scientists' theory of evolution fails to explain how conscious thoughts seem to be disconnected with neuronal activity arising before, after, and during consciousness. Therefore, we not only noted that scientists surmise that consciousness is merely a phantom effect of complex neuronal activity, but we also recognize that when cognitive neuroscientists consider personhood to be a phantom effect, they confound epistemology's quest to establish the centrality of personal judgment from which we assess the environment. To address the scientist's epistemological shortfall, Immanuel's law's first derivative statement demonstrates that the natural laws and energy's discrete emission reflect both a cognitive and physical expression of a function, even a functional expression that scales God's absolute being and power to the effect that the functional expression derives our temporal being and knowledge structure as a reflection of God's absolute being and knowledge structure. Essentially, the statement demonstrates the reality of the functional expression to the extent that the statement renders an epistemological description concerning how the environment unfolds and instigates the query of the dynamic mechanism that the brain apprehends. As we shall see, Immanuel's law's second derivative statement demonstrates that the dynamic mechanism correlates with the intentionality of our personhood. In response to the first derivative statement's epistemological description of the functional order that incites the mind, the second derivative statement presents a falsifiable hypothesis of how the dynamic mechanism of our mind arises. The statement identifies how the dynamic mechanism temporarily adapts the brain's neuronal systems while remaining free of them to render conscious effects that are not direct consequences of the neuronal systems. Like so, the second statement corrects cognitive neuroscientists' erroneous supposition that personhood is an epiphenomenon, a phantom effect. Though the discipline of cognitive neuroscience produces profound and detailed observations of how neuronal activities parallel cognitive states and bodily operations, most cognitive neuroscientists will readily confess that cognitive neuroscience has not produced an understanding of the exact mechanism of the brain in terms of how it produces cognitive effects in bodily actions. But though they recognize that they do not possess a true understanding of the brain's mechanical functionality, they fail to come to terms with the consequence of their not having a mechanical picture. They fail to accept that they do not possess a complete, falsifiable understanding of the brain and nervous system's functional operation. And so, we must again underscore the fact that in the same manner in which physicists confound epistemological understanding because they lack a full mechanical picture of the cause of the Big Bang, the natural laws, and energy's discrete emission, cognitive neuroscientists confound epistemological understanding because they lack a full mechanical picture of the brain. As an example, we may recall like so how cognitive neuroscientists confound epistemological understanding. We may recount how they arrive at the belief that our conscious personhood is an epiphenomenon. First, we recall that cognitive neuroscientists possess a straightforward mechanical understanding of the neuronal circuitry that govern the manner in which sensory neurons register environmental events and thereby cause motor neurons to enact bodily responses. But then, we saw how cognitive neuroscientists fail to employ their evolutionary model to grasp how the neuron's electrochemical firings amount to awareness, cognizance, and sense perceptions. We then saw how they attempt to resolve this evolutionary shortfall. We observed that the cognitive neuroscientists first recognized that brain pathologies reveal that each brain area is responsible for various modes of cognition. And like so, we understood that they then hold that the brain regions evolved by producing complex circuitry that supervenes over the simple circuitry and so leaving the appearance of supervening cognizant will. Finally, as we saw how their acceptance that the supervenience of an evolved neuronal circuitry amounts to personhoods being an epiphenomenon, we recognize why they avoid the necessity of arriving at a mechanical or epistemological understanding of cognition altogether. We saw that they rather resort to a procedural interpretation of brain activity during cognition and awareness states. And so in the end, we understood that in their procedural interpretations, they simply point out which respective brain region is active during the various modes of cognition. To replace the procedural description with a falsifiable mechanical description, Immanuel's law's second derivative statement points out the brain's mechanical operation, that is, what the brain is translating and what the operation achieves as an effect. Evolutionary theory cannot grasp the mechanism because of its classical worldview of linear causality. However, the first derivative statement posits the conventional circumstances that the brain responds to, as the first statement anticipates the operation of the brain's very dynamic mechanism. The first statement shows that the functional effect of nonlinear syntactical causality is a normalized world that is perennially in modal operation, that is, a normalized world that exists in equal ontological standing with states that could be. And so the first statement anticipates the mechanical operation of the dynamic mind. The statement understands that only the mind's rational capacity can grasp the modal nature of the world by grasping the potentiality of the world as the mind renormalizes, that is, reconceptualizes the world per the mind's finite perspective. And so, in order for us to understand how Immanuel's law's second derivative statement fulfills epistemology's quest for the justified true belief of our knowledge, we must recognize four principles that factor into science's establishing a falsifiable understanding of how the brain obtains personhood and cognition. First, the second statement recognizes that cognition must stand upon the mechanical operation of the brain's renormalizing the modal effects of the microscopic world's EM waves, normalizing the microscopic world's quantum indeterminacy. Indeed, the first statement alludes to the fact that the appearing mind must stand upon an operative capacity to renormalize the normalized world per the mind's state of being. Second, the mechanical operation must therefore entail an initial renormalization. Third, the initial renormalization must be associated with a personalized renormalization. And fourth, the renormalization process must culminate into a matching and retention capacity. Then finally, the whole system must constitute the mechanical operation as a dynamic reference frame, as the second derivative statement points out. Thus, directly answering the epistemological question, the second statement shows how the system is the physical correlate to our finite knowledge structure as defined by the categories of judgment. To identify the brain's mechanical operation and how it culminates into the mind's dynamic reference frame, the second statement recognizes the key understanding in all mechanical design. And that is that one may identify what powers a mechanical operation and that part of the mechanical system that actively fights against the system's natural tendency for entropic wear and tear, that is, breakdown. The second statement therefore responds to Immanuel's law's preceding empirical statement's understanding that the physical correlate of the unity of personhood must transcend the entropy, that is, the pathologies of the brain's biological systems. The second statement observes that the brain's electromagnetic waves accomplish this. Therefore, the second statement understands that the electromagnetic waves play a foundational role in the brain's achieving personhood. By keeping in mind the four mechanical principles that the physical correlate of consciousness must entail, we may now briefly detail how the second statement unites the four principles with cognitive neurosciences observations to obtain a falsifiable hypothesis of the mind's renormalizing mechanical operation. Like so, we will understand how the second statement endeavors to replace cognitive neurosciences' procedural approach as Immanuel's law seeks to advance science and epistemological understanding. In regards to the first mechanical principle, that is, the brain must renormalize the modal effects of the normalized world, let us keep in mind that the real world consists of innumerable subatomic quantum structures that first normalize into the appearing structure of the atom with its nucleus and orbiting electrons. Moreover, we must keep in mind that the normalized appearance of the atom occurs upon the atom's exchange of light's photon particle waves with other atoms. And so, we must recognize that the classical world properties that we observe in normative cause-effect sequences only appear as an outcome of the normalizing process. With that said, The second statement agrees, at first, with cognitive neurosciences' interpretations of the brain's complex substructures, which entail a myriad of neuronal firing rates, intensities, and patterns. The statement understands that these substructures must mimic or record the body's environment by using the litany of senses that achieve a myriad of intensities and sequences that interface with the structures of the appearing world. Howbeit, the second statement goes a step ahead of cognitive neurosciences' considerations of neuronal activities. It recognizes that the brain's architecture must entail concentrations of neuronal structures to perform a renormalizing process in order to imprint the diverse and relative magnitudes of the normalized world. The statement understands that only in this manner can the neuronal structures imprint and then register as the cognitive perceptions of such normalized and correlating magnitudes as light and sound. And so, to proceed in detailing how the second derivative statement describes the brain's renormalizing process, let us again keep in mind the subject matter of the second statement's hypothesis. The subject matter is, of course, to establish that the foundation of conscious perception is the brain's capacity to renormalize the brain's electrochemical impressions of the world. With this pursuit, the second statement recognizes a key relationship. As light's photon exchange normalizes the real world, the brain's EM waves transcend the brain's entropic pathologies to renormalize neuronal sense impressions of the world with magnitudinous models. The models are the physical correlates of concepts, and so rather than relying on a procedural approach of pointing out areas in the brain that correspond with cognitive structures, the second statement hypothesizes the mechanical operation of the brain's renormalizing process. In this way, the statement uncovers a process that actually correlates with the structure of our emerging cognitions. Essentially, by simply postulating that the brain's electromagnetic waves renormalize neuronal sense impressions with magnitudinous models, Immanuel's law's second derivative statement responds to the first of four falsifiable principles concerning the brain's obtaining personhood in cognition. The second statement simply observes that the electromagnetic waves' renormalizing neuronal sense impressions must occur in order for personhood and cognition to perceive the world per the individual's state of being. We mentioned that the second, third, and fourth principles respectively entail an initial renormalization process, then a personalized renormalization capacity, and finally a retentive renormalization capacity. And so, in deference to the second principle, Immanuel's law's second derivative statement puts forth the falsifiable hypothesis that the brain's initial renormalizing capacity occurs at the electromagnetic waves' interface with the cerebral cortex. Then, for the third principle, the second statement postulates that the brain's personalized renormalization capacity occurs at the electromagnetic waves' interface with the thalamus, basal ganglia, and hippocampus circuits. Moreover, the statement points out that this circuit relates back to the cerebral cortex. Finally, for the fourth principle, the statement concludes that the brain's retentive renormalization capacity occurs at the same basal ganglia and hippocampus region, which cognitive neuroscientists denote as memory centers. Seamlessly, the second statement marries cognitive neuroscience observations with its hypothesis, which entail the principles concerning how the brain's renormalizing process correlates with the emerging structure of cognition. As an outcome, Immanuel's law's second derivative statement secures falsifiable and successive predictions that describe the manner in which cognition arises. In other words, the second statement secures a priori synthetic judgments that scientists can test, verify, and advance an understanding of. First, the second statement concludes that the charged ions of the cerebral cortex's neuronal layers interface with the brain's naturally occurring EM waves and so encode magnitudinous relationships. These magnitudinous relationships correlate with what behavioral psychologists and phenomenologists describe as the givingness of concepts. Then, as the cerebral cortex circuit relates to the thalamus, basal ganglia, and hippocampus regions of the brain, even regions that contain complementing neuronal structures like the cerebral cortex, the statement notes how the regions amplify and/or augment the cerebral cortex's initial renormalizing magnitudinous relationships. Moreover, with this finding, the statement observes that these regions act as retentive faculties. Finally, the second statement postulates that sustained magnitudinous perturbations occur as ongoing impressions often fail to match what the retentive regions imprint. As a consequence, the statement at long last concludes that the perturbations correlate with the first-person sense of self, a magnitudinous sense that is veritable sentience. Now that we have briefly observed how Immanuel's law's second derivative statement distinguishes the physical correlate to personhood, we may now see how the second statement rescues both Western philosophy and science by fully answering our leading question: how does Immanuel's law establish epistemology's quest for the justified true belief of our knowledge? Remember, the question seeks to discover how we conceptualize classifications through which we can frame falsifiable evaluations of the world. And so we are essentially saying that we may now fully recognize how Immanuel's law's second derivative statement describes in a falsifiable manner how the human brain's renormalizing process generates conceptions that instinctively draws classifications. From this understanding, we will see how Immanuel's law rescues contemporary science, which misguidedly frames all observable phenomenon under the short-sighted evolutionary model. So before we see how the second statement details how the brain frames concepts, we must quickly recall why contemporary scientists fail to answer the question. We must recall the shortcomings of their classical worldview's linear view of causality, which their evolutionary model entails. Afterward, we can understand how the second statement answers the epistemological question, even to the extent that the statement mechanically distinguishes the difference between animal life's instinctive intelligence and human life's rational intelligence, which is at first instinctive and then rational, to the end that through theological, philosophical, and scientific concepts, human intelligence grasps the breadth of existence beyond its means. Once again, let us keep in mind that the underlying epistemological question for both philosophy and science is to know how we conceptualize classifications, whereby we may secure falsifiable evaluations of them. And with that in mind, let us remember the chief points that scientists classify and evaluate under their evolutionary model of the universe. The first chief point is that the universe's start and subsequent evolution began with the Big Bang, which the scientists deemed necessary to make the universe's heavy subatomic particles. Second, the universe's cooling and ensuing particle decay formed the known elements that comprise the galaxies and respective solar systems. Then of note is scientists' understanding of the advent of biological evolution. Scientists hold that the process began when self-replicating molecules maintained inherited traits that adapted to changing environments due to the fitness of the biological organism. With this last chief point, scientists seek to explain, classify, and evaluate the emergence of all biological life forms. They use the evolutionary model to explain the successive similarities between species, including the striking similarities between apes and humans. For instance, the ape brain's neocortex, which is responsible for reasoning, bears notable similarities with humankind's more endowed neocortex. We have discussed repeatedly how the evolutionary model fails to explain the Big Bang, the cause of the natural laws, and energy's discrete emission. And as we consider Immanuel's law's second derivative statement, we are now seeing that the evolutionary model fails to anticipate or explain how the brain renormalizes quantum indeterminacy to grasp concepts that cohere with the normalized appearing of the world events within uniform spacetime. So, in consideration of the evolutionary model's falsifiable shortfall, we are continuing to see how Immanuel's law's first and second derivative statements resolve the shortfall. We are finally seeing how the statements provide the correct epistemological framework that captures the brain's conceptual classifications from which we may secure falsifiable evaluations of the observable world. For example, they're foregoing an explanation for the Big Bang, the natural laws, and energy's discrete emissions. Scientists rather matter-of-factly use the evolutionary framework solely to evaluate all things coming into being as a consequence of particle decay. And yet, while we may understand that Immanuel's law recognizes particle decay, we also understand that Immanuel's law's first derivative statement demonstrates that the particle wave's indeterminate discrete energy reflects the fact that causality is a syntactical scaling of God's absolute power. Furthermore, we understand that the effect of syntactical causality is a macroscopic world that modally comes into ontological being, to the effect that the modal order incites the mind to grasp the world's modal appearing dynamically by generating magnitudinous analogs per the mind's finite perspective. And so, where scientists use an evolutionary framework to evaluate how all plant and animal species come into being, only to dismiss the mind as an epiphenomenon, Immanuel's law's derivative statements demonstrates that the classical worldview, under which scientists frame the evolutionary concept, fails to recognize the fact that the mind is the brain's mechanical response to the true quantum nature of the world. Indeed, we may now see how evolutionary theory cannot account for the mind's capacity to renormalize quantum indeterminacy, which enables the mind to apprehend objects and events appearing within the uniform succession of spacetime. In other words, we may now point out why evolutionary theory is a short-sighted classical worldview concept. We can infer from Immanuel's law's first derivative statement that the evolutionary concept rightfully observes the fact that macroscopic biological systems endure genetic mutations that survive ever-changing macroscopic environments according to the utility of the fitness of the genetic mutation. However, we can also conclude from the first derivative statement that the evolutionary process is an effect of syntactical causality. Therefore, the evolutionary process is not necessarily the absolute cause of material and biological similitude and diversification, as the brain's renormalizing capacity demonstrates. You see, the brain's capacity to renormalize quantum indeterminacy to apprehend a uniform world entails the renormalization process that matches macroscopic scaled magnitudinous models with the indeterminate modal effects of the microscopic quantum world. The indeterminacy is on a microscopic scale, beyond the mathematical capacity for any macroscopic genetic mutation to match through any naturally occurring statistical process. And so Immanuel's law decisively demonstrates the fact that the theory of evolution cannot possibly explain the advent of human and animal consciousness. Therefore, evolutionary theory falls short of entirely classifying the universe's material and biological systems. In sum, Immanuel's law secures conceptual classifications for science's falsifiable evaluations. Immanuel's law recognizes particle decay and evolution solely as a modal effect of syntactical causality, and to grasp purposefulness of the causality, Immanuel's law draws from its theological and empirical statements the fact that God mitigates his ontological being to enable our knowledge structure. The theological and empirical statements' descriptions are in fact in agreement with the classical philosophers' epistemological categories of judgment concerning how the attributes of similitude and succession are necessary for the enabling of our knowledge structure, because these categorical systems enable our propositional knowledge structure to form the analogues of analogy. Unfortunately, contemporary scientists mistake the strata of material and biological phenomena to be the sole consequence of evolution, when in fact the successional strata have the function of inciting our knowledge structure. So, as we keep Immanuel's law's epistemological framework in mind, we may complete our description of how the second derivative statement answers our leading epistemological question. Observing the four principles that the brain's renormalizing process must entail, we so far have observed how the second statement secures the falsifiable means to describe the physical correlate of consciousness, even as the statement successfully reinterprets cognitive neuroscience's procedural descriptions. Let us once more recall the four principles as follows. First, cognition must stand upon a mechanical operation that renormalizes the modal effects of the macroscopic world's electromagnetic waves, normalizing of the microscopic world's quantum indeterminacy. Second, an initial renormalizing operation must occur. Third, a personalized renormalizing operation must follow. And fourth, an ongoing renormalizing process that functions as matching and retention of magnitudinous representations must persist as veritable cognition itself. Now, we saw that the second derivative statement began its falsifiable hypothesis by deducing that the brain's initial renormalizing process occurs at the cerebral cortex's interface with local electromagnetic waves. Then we saw how the statement further deduces that the personalized renormalizing process, as well as the matching and retention renormalizing process, occur in the brain regions of the thalamus, basal ganglia, and hippocampus circuits. And then ultimately, we understood how the second statement concludes that the sustained magnitudinous perturbations occurring during the matching and retention process actually functions as the dynamic reference frame. We even saw that the dynamic reference frame correlates with the centrality of judgment, upon which stands our propositional knowledge structure's ongoing cognitions, which again entail the searching and matching of new magnitudinous impressions with ongoing neuronal connections in the brain's memory centers. To step ahead and seize a falsifiable and epistemological understanding of the complete physical correlate to human consciousness, let us here recognize that we have only so far observed from the second derivative statement a description of the physical correlate to the instinctive base of our knowledge structure, a base that we share in common with animals. So, to observe how the second derivative statement draws out the striking distinction between human and animal consciousness, we have only to note how the second statement corrects scientists' short-sighted evolutionary understanding of the brain's neocortex and the other regions that cognitive neuroscientists deem to be responsible for our reasoning capacity. Now remember, scientists believe that the physical similarities between human and ape neocortices, as well as their DNA, is a result of the evolutionary process, wherein they suppose that the fitness and survival of various genetic mutations affecting human neocortices gave us an endowed reasoning capacity over the apes. For sure, the scientists' conclusions are compelling. However, we know from our lessons learned heretofore that it is literally impossible for the macroscopic adaptations of DNA to produce mutations in a way that calculatedly matches the brain's capacity to renormalize its electromagnetic waves to generate magnitudinous models of the modally appearing normalized world. Thus, we fully understand why the second derivative statement dismisses any evolutionary considerations, as the second statement postulates the actual functionality of the neocortex. The second derivative statement considers the neocortex only in the light of the four principles that encapsulate how any cognition stands upon a renormalizing process. In particular, the second statement understands that the basis of our human reasoning is our capacity to retain a self-narrative ability in the light of our perceiving ourselves in the world. The statement therefore describes our capacity to generate a self-narrative as our ability to objectify the very act of cognition. And so the second derivative statement deduces what necessary operation that the neocortex must achieve to become the physical correlate of our capacity to objectify the very act of cognition. In the light of the four renormalizing principles that cognition must stand upon, Immanuel's law's second derivative statement postulates that the neocortex's renormalizing operation must assume an auxiliary function that coordinates the cerebral cortex's initial renormalizing process and the thalamic circuit's personalizing renormalizing process. Thus, the second statement understands that the neocortex must adapt electromagnetic waves to generate magnitudinous representations of the modally normalized world. Likewise, the statement understands that the neocortex must not merely adapt electromagnetic waves in order to search and match ongoing magnitudinous impressions from the cerebral cortex. Instead, the second statement understands that the neocortex circuits interface with the cerebral cortex, and the thalamic circuits rationalizes both renormalizing processes to achieve the physical correlation to our cognitive capacity to objectify comprehension. In other words, the second statement envisions how the neocortex generates magnitudinous representations that are the physical correlate to our rational capacity to apprehend the functional operations underlying all our experiences. Finally, we see that having presented a falsifiable hypothesis of how the neocortex maintains an auxiliary renormalizing process that correlates with humanity's rational capacity, Immanuel's law's second derivative statement establishes epistemology's quest for the justified true belief of our knowledge. Therefore, we see that Immanuel's law answers our leading question concerning how to determine how the physical correlate to our personhood arises to adapt the neurological systems of the brain to conceptualize classifications through which we can secure falsifiable evaluations of the environment per our temporal senses of being. So, by fully answering the epistemological question, Immanuel's law provides falsifiable verification for key classical philosophy and contemporary phenomenology's epistemological descriptions of humanity's knowledge structure. The second derivative statement's descriptions of the cerebral cortex's initial renormalizing process correlates with classical philosophy and phenomenology's understanding of the givenness of concepts. Likewise, the second statement's description of the thalamic circuit's personalizing renormalizing process correlates with classical Kantian philosophy's description of our grounding concepts within the intuition of self within space and time. And lastly, the second statement's description of the manner in which the neocortex performs as an auxiliary renormalizing process that rationalizes preceding renormalizing processes correlates with philosophy's understanding that our rational thoughts ascend beyond to what appears to apprehend the background of all that we perceive. Of all, what we may conclude of our brief survey of the highlights of Immanuel's law is that Immanuel's law saves key principles of Western philosophy by providing a falsifiable epistemological understanding that will enable us to advance contemporary science by resolving its shortfalls. Where contemporary science failed to describe the cause of the Big Bang, energy's discrete emission, and the nature of our personhood, Immanuel's law describes the functional cause of creation and energy's resulting discrete emission, and ultimately the physical correlate of consciousness. For the first time in the history of civilization, Immanuel's law establishes with falsifiable means what constitutes the essence of who we are, in terms of our sense of individuality and independent personhood, the very foundations of our spirits and even our souls. Every civilization has wrestled with two primary questions that lay at the heart of organizing prosperous societies. The first question is there a God who instills in us an ethical conscience that pursues truth and justice? And the second question is, what is the relationship between the identity and rights of the individual versus the identity and rights of the family, clan, organized community, religious society, and government under which the individual resides? Innumerable instances of personal, family, communal, civil, religious, and international strife have occurred and still occur because civilizations fail to determine the balance between individual rights versus social, civil, religious, and governmental authority. Throughout the vast majority of human history, the commoner masses of people lived in circumstances where group-based relationships had the preponderance of authority over individuals. Individuals only began to enjoy the preponderance of authority at the end of the 18th century, upon the establishment of Western constitutional governments, which presently ensure the individual's constitutional rights regardless of the individual's group-based affinities. What is important for us to recognize is the fact that the libertarian ideals of Western constitutional government are the direct result of the cultural maturity that the Christian Church fostered over the warlike and conflicting Germanic tribes. Initially, the Church produced a universal cultural identity, entailing a universal sense of ethics and other social norms. Then, after innovation, commerce, and invention arose upon Christendom's unified social order, the enlightened philosophers envisioned ways to order governments around individual merit and skills and moral aptitude, regardless of the individual's group-based ties, such as religious and family affinities. Finally, the ideals of the Protestant Reformation gave commoners a universal sense of libertarian ideals. The Reformation emphasized that religious works, family standing, and other group-based rights had no efficacy. The Reformations emphasized that only the grace of God through an individual's faith in the finished work of the Christ, who only has standing before God, secured the individual's standing before God. Recognizing such teachings help common peoples to accept constitutional governments that recognize the diverse beliefs of the people. You see, the educated Protestant recognized that his or her personal abilities and affinities do not give his or her person more worth than others who hold other beliefs. While we appreciate how individual rights emerged in significance over group-based rights, we must recognize that the current challenge to individual rights does not necessarily derive from one particular group. The challenge is a result of contemporary science and philosophy's struggle to determine to what extent does individual personhood exist. Indeed, we must recognize that political scientists and other overseers of jurisprudence increasingly struggle to determine to what extent does an individual enjoy self-determination over the behavioral responses that a person's physical and social environment imposes upon him or her. As we mentioned before, more and more thinkers agree with scientists that personhood is an epiphenomenon of behavioral impressions. Therefore, a person's legal standing is increasingly being called into question in terms of a person's right to property, a person's culpability for the committal of crimes, and a person's moral and entrepreneurial merit over another person who may not have enjoyed the same level of opportunity. As a consequence of the scientific question of personhood, the integrity of Western constitutional government falters. As we recognize the dire threat that the unresolved question of personhood poses to individual freedom, we may recognize the profound implications of Immanuel's law. Its derivative statements demonstrably employ science's falsifiable means to settle the question of individual personhood. Of course, we have seen that as its basis, Immanuel's law vindicates the Christian Church's theological description of the nature of God and his necessary grace. Even so, as we have described before, Immanuel's law does not only complement the Church's orthodox teachings. Immanuel's law complements many epistemological understandings of Western philosophers from whom the enlightened philosophers gleaned their libertarian ideals from. The enlightened philosophers endeavored to put into practice Western philosophers' belief in the possibility and viability of the common peoples having the capacity to establish constitutional governments. And so, Immanuel's law does not only prove the reality of individual personhood, but also prove an individual's capacity to reason. All said, Immanuel's law resoundingly reinvigorates the Western principle of the freedom to adhere or not adhere to religious observance. And Immanuel's law reinvigorates the Western principle of the freedom of self-determination, with rights to property under a government that ensures an individual's constitutional rights. Immanuel's law champions the continuance of a free, democratic society. Since the death of the apostles of the Lord Jesus the Christ, the Church has struggled to establish doctrinal orthodoxy by securing a true interpretation of the apostolically affirmed biblical canon of Holy Scripture. The chief struggle in interpreting the Holy Scriptures was to settle an understanding of the Scripture's description of the three distinct persons of God, which Orthodox and mainstream Christians know as the Trinity. To settle the matter, the Church put forth the time-honored creeds of Christendom to confirm a right and universal interpretation of the three persons of God, as well as his necessary grace, which defies the personal merit of any individual over another. Mainstream Christian denominations have prospered and proliferated in their universal adherence to the Christian creeds. They're even becoming the moral compass for Western society. However, the Church's adherence to the creeds do not entirely defend them against what has become the greatest threat that the Church has faced. Today's Western society no longer relies upon religious tradition to base political and ethical decisions upon. Today's society relies upon science. Thus, Western society's reliance upon the doctrinal validity of the creeds is of far less value to secular society because the orthodox determinations of the creeds are not scientifically falsifiable. As a consequence, the Church is increasingly losing its role of providing a moral compass for government policy and societal values. The sole purpose of Immanuel's law is to support the doctrinal treatise entitled The Landscape of Truth, an orthodox understanding of the biblical testaments for the true worshipers. The doctrinal treatise not only adheres to the Christian creeds, but also advances the paramount importance of the testaments and their recording the manner in which God's three persons are necessary for the emergence of thought and action over any possible world. We have discussed at length how Immanuel's law understands that God is whole and absolute ontological being, a synthesis of spirit, consisting of absolute power, knowledge, and presence. And so we saw that any extension of any possible world is an act of God's grace through which he mitigates his absolute ontological being by creating our finite being as a reflection of him. Then we saw that the establishment of our ontological being entails God's modally expressing the worlds in a manner that incites the dynamic reference frame of our person to forever query after our own well-being within a greater world. Thus we understood that our finite knowledge structure stands upon the givenness of a physical and social environmental network that incites our personhood's dynamic reference frames. But what we have not covered is the significance of Immanuel's law third and final derivative statement. Though we will not survey the third statement in full here, we can say that the pithy of the statement is that it recognizes that God's establishing and affirming God's absolute requires that God give his peace upon our recognizing our incapacity to establish our own peace. And this ultimate act of God's grace is God's giving us his person to complete our own person, and God's giving us his Holy Spirit of communion to complete our unjust and short-sighted community. Immanuel's law's third derivative statement essentially demonstrates that the falsifiable determinations of the first and second derivative statements directly reflect the reality of God's completion of our personhood in the Christ, Lord Jesus, the Savior of good conscience, and God's completion of our community in the Holy Spirit, who reconciles and establishes the communion of the saints. What is more, the third derivative statement discusses the paramount importance of God's beatific expression of grace. Like so, the third statement sets up the remainder of the doctrinal treatise, which then gives a systematic theological understanding of the biblical testaments. The remaining chapters demonstrate how the biblical testaments capture, in particular, God's necessary expression of grace at the pivotal points of human civilization's development. Initially, the work draws inspiration from classical Greek philosophers' categorical descriptions of the stages of human government. Then the doctrinal treaties successively list how God's covenants witness first to humanity's patriarchal communities, as seen in God's covenant with Abraham. Next, the treatise describes how God's covenants witness to humanity's monarchic communities, as seen in God's covenant with King David. Then, as the biblical testaments record the fall of the Davidic monarchy, the doctrinal treatise points out how God, through the testament, expresses his grace by simply pouring out his Holy Spirit upon humankind to deliver us from the remaining shortfalls of human government. The treatise describes how the monarchies, aristocracies, and democracies of the biblical period culminate in the federal empire of ancient Rome, which represents the height of human government. At that point, the treatise describes how God exemplifies his absolute power, knowledge, and presence by his prevailing over the shortfalls of humanity's individual personhood and community. To this end, the work describes how God invokes the power of his testament to prevail over the insufficient human government by God's appearing in the personhood of the Christ and the personhood of the Holy Spirit. First, in the personhood of the Christ, God exemplifies the fulfillment of the love, righteousness, and justice that his laws of conscience seek. Then after human injustice kills the Christ, God enacts the testament in a manner that overcomes the human frailties that lead to their unjust acts. God simply writes his Holy Spirit indiscriminately upon the hearts of whom he freely elects, without regard to race, male or female sex, family or religious works, or social standing. You see, by his simply giving the elect a faith and desire for the resurrected Christ's righteousness, God overcomes the prejudices and selfish pursuits of injustice that lead to human society's shortfall. Indeed, the treatise describes how God appears in the personhood of the Holy Spirit to point to an eternal kingdom of heaven that consists of a community wedded in holy marriage to the righteousness of Christ. Like so, the treatise describes how God currently inspires individuals to exemplify God's eternal righteousness by their loving and seeking justice for all people without regard for human prejudice. As a key example, near the end of the treatise, the work describes how the Protestant Reformation pervasively gave common Europeans an understanding that religious works and other social acts resulting in prejudice do not lead to God's righteousness. Only individual faith that God only can indiscriminately confer upon the heart assumes Christ's righteousness. With this description, the treatise points out that common Europeans gained a more enlightened acceptance for constitutional government than what the secular Enlightenment could inspire. One may safely conclude, therefore, that Immanuel's law is an orthodox doctrine, especially as it provides falsifiable evidence for a treatise that lives up to its name of being an orthodox doctrine of the biblical testaments for the true worshipers. One may find Immanuel's law in the 3rd chapter of the doctrinal treatise, The Landscape of Truth, an orthodox understanding of the biblical testaments for the true worshipers. Hard theological questions concerning the mystery of God briefly open the Landscape's 3rd chapter. The chapter's opening then briefly notes how the creeds of Christendom, to their credit, do not profess to answer all difficult questions. The creeds just make faithful determinations on what the apostolically affirmed scriptures state. Shortly thereafter, introductory material precedes Immanuel's law. The material begins with a short discussion concerning the fact that contemporary science cannot depend upon church doctrine because the doctrine, no matter how compelling, is not falsifiable. Following the discussion of the inadmissibility of church doctrine, the introductory material describes the development of contemporary science and its inability to explain the cause of the universe in humanity's first-person sense of self. And then finally, after the introductory material, the reader will find Immanuel's law, consisting of 3 derivative statements, which are preceded by a theological statement and an empirical statement. This presentation is to explain what Immanuel's law is and to highlight its importance. However, if one wishes to find out more about Immanuel's law in a greater context, one may find out more about the entire doctrinal treatise on thelandscapeoftruth.com. Thelandscapeoftruth.com has its own worth. To expound upon the doctrinal treatise, thelandscapeoftruth.com produces articles of current events, demonstrating how the cultures trading in the increasingly integrative global economy are ebbing back into civilization's historical state of recognizing the significance of group authority over individual rights. So to combat the deterioration of individual rights and democracy, thelandscapeoftruth.com stresses how doctrinally literate Christians continue to play a key role in preserving democracy for themselves and unbelievers. Thelandscapeoftruth.com pulls countless examples from its doctrinal treatise, exemplifying how the individual faith of all Christians can look past human prejudice to seek justice for all without relying upon increasingly autocratic centralized governments. Actually reading Immanuel's law and the rest of the landscape of truth may seem like a mammoth task, but we know that the tried and proven strategy for tackling an intimidating work is to read one sentence at a time. We are certainly confident that when the task is over, the reader will never see the world in the same way. The reader will understand how the world in its entirety, that is, the galaxies, our earthly environment, civilization, and our personal relationships, is ultimately created for God to express his love by uniting all in his selfless and loving personhood of Lord Jesus the Christ and the reconciling communion of the Holy Spirit. So we will actually help you get started by reading for you the Landscape of Truth's short but worthy acknowledgments page. Non nobis, Domine, sed nomine tuo da gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, but to thy name give the glory.